The bullet grazed Lena's shoulder at the exact moment she understood what it meant to choose someone else's life over your own. Blood soaked through her white uniform shirt as she pressed the trembling 6-year-old girl against the cold steel of the prep counter. But all she could think about were the child's eyes, wide and terrified, staring up at her like she was the only solid thing left in a world that had just exploded into chaos. The girl's small fingers dug into Lena's arm with desperate strength, and somewhere beneath the ringing in her ears from the gunshots still echoing through the café, Lena heard herself whispering words she didn't remember choosing. "Stay with me. I've got you. You're safe now." She had no idea if any of that was true. 12 minutes earlier, Lena Moore had been wiping down tables in the afternoon lull, her mind wandering through the usual places it went during slow shifts at Romano's café. Rent was due in 4 days. Her car needed new brakes. Her sister hadn't returned her calls in 3 weeks. The kind of thoughts that filled the quiet spaces of a 24-year-old waitress whose life had become a careful routine of survival, nothing more and nothing less. She'd learned to keep her head down, do her job well, and not ask questions about the men in expensive suits who sometimes reserved the private dining room in the back. The café sat on a busy corner in the city's downtown district, the kind of place where lawyers grabbed coffee between court appearances and construction workers ordered sandwiches during lunch breaks. Lena had worked there for 18 months, long enough to recognize the regular customers and short enough that she still felt like an outsider looking in at everyone else's more important lives. She was good at being invisible. It was safer that way. The black SUV appeared without warning, tires screaming against asphalt as it lurched to a stop outside the café's front windows. Lena looked up from the table she was cleaning, her cloth frozen mid-wipe, as 3 men in dark clothes emerged from the vehicle with movements that were too quick and too purposeful. Her stomach dropped before her brain could process why. The glass door shattered inward with a crash that made everyone in the dining area scream and duck. Lena dropped to a crouch beside a booth, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Voices shouted commands she couldn't understand, and then came the sound that would replay in her nightmares for months afterward. The sharp crack of gunfire, loud and impossibly close, followed by screaming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She saw the little girl before anyone else did. The child emerged from the hallway that led to the private rooms, her dark hair bouncing as she ran, her patent leather shoes clicking against the tile floor. She wore a navy blue dress with white flowers on it, the kind of dress that suggested someone had chosen it with care that morning, and her face held an expression that Lena recognized instantly because she'd worn it herself as a child. Confusion. Terror. The desperate need for someone to explain why the world had suddenly become so loud and wrong. The girl stopped in the center of the dining area, turning in a circle as if looking for something or someone, and that's when Lena saw the armed man near the entrance swing his weapon toward the back of the café. Toward the hallway. Toward the child. Lena's body moved before her mind caught up. She launched herself from behind the booth, closing the distance to the girl in 4 running steps that felt like moving through water. Her arms wrapped around the small body just as another window exploded, raining glass across the floor where they'd been standing a second earlier. The girl let out a startled cry, but Lena was already turning, already pulling them both toward the kitchen doors, her only thought the desperate need to put something solid between this child and the violence tearing through the café. They crashed through the swinging kitchen doors together, and Lena's training from countless rushed shifts took over. She knew this kitchen. She knew every corner and counter and exit. She dragged the girl toward the prep area where the industrial equipment created a maze of steel surfaces, shoving them both behind the largest counter as another volley of shots rang out. The girl whimpered, and Lena pressed her hand gently over the child's mouth, not to silence her but to comfort her, pulling her close and tucking the small body against her own. That's when the pain came, sharp and burning across her shoulder. Lena gasped, her vision blurring for a second, but she didn't loosen her grip on the girl. She could feel something warm running down her arm, soaking into her sleeve, but it seemed distant and unimportant compared to the weight of the child in her arms and the sound of heavy footsteps moving through the dining area beyond the kitchen doors. She needed to get them out. The back exit. The alley. Somewhere away from the guns and the shouting and the smell of smoke that was starting to fill the air. She shifted her grip on the girl, biting back a cry as pain lanced through her shoulder, and whispered directly into the child's ear. "We're going to move now. Stay close to me. Don't let go." The girl nodded against her chest, her small hands fisting in Lena's apron. They moved in a crouch, Lena using her body to shield the child as they navigated between the prep stations toward the back corridor. Each step felt like it took an hour. Each breath burned in her lungs. The kitchen's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. Lena's hand left bloody prints on the wall as she steadied herself, but she kept moving, kept pulling the girl forward, kept putting distance between them and the chaos they'd left behind. The fire exit loomed ahead, its red emergency bar gleaming under the safety lights. Lena hit it with her hip, and the door swung open to reveal the alley, bright with afternoon sunlight that hurt her eyes after the dim kitchen. She pulled the girl through, then reached back to slam the door shut, her fingers fumbling with the external lock until it clicked into place. The metal felt cool against her forehead as she leaned against it for just a moment, trying to catch her breath, trying to process what had just happened. That's when she felt the small arms wrap around her waist. The girl was crying now, silent sobs that shook her whole body, and Lena sank down to the dirty alley pavement, pulling the child into her lap and rocking her gently despite the fire in her shoulder and the exhaustion that was starting to creep through her limbs. She could hear shouts from inside the café, boots on tile, and then the distinct sound of car engines roaring to life. The attack was ending as quickly as it had begun, but Lena couldn't bring herself to move yet. Not when the girl needed this. Not when she needed this. The sirens grew deafening, and suddenly the alley was full of people in uniforms, police and paramedics swarming around them with questions and hands reaching to separate them. Lena tried to explain what had happened, but her words came out jumbled and strange, and all she could focus on was the way the girl's fingers had tangled in her apron strings, refusing to let go even as someone tried to check her for injuries. Then a man appeared, moving through the crowd with an authority that made everyone step aside. He was tall, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Lena made in 3 months, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much of the wrong things. His face was hard until he saw the girl, and then something cracked in his expression, something that looked almost like pain. The girl saw him and cried out, but she didn't let go of Lena. The man dropped to one knee beside them, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out to touch his daughter's face, checking her for injuries with movements that were surprisingly gentle for someone who looked like he could break bones without effort. He spoke in Italian, rapid words that Lena couldn't understand, but the tone was clear. Relief. Fear. Gratitude. A paramedic was trying to examine Lena's shoulder, but the girl had wrapped herself around Lena so tightly that it was impossible to separate them without causing more distress. Lena met the man's eyes over his daughter's head, and she saw him really look at her for the first time. Saw him take in the blood on her uniform, the way she was still shielding his child with her body even though the danger had passed, the exhaustion and pain written across her face. The paramedic said something about needing to treat the gunshot wound, and the words seemed to hit the man like a physical blow. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke his English carried a slight accent but was perfectly clear. "You took a bullet for my daughter." Lena shook her head, suddenly uncomfortable with the weight of his stare. "I just pulled her out of the way. Anyone would have done the same." The man's expression suggested he didn't believe that for a second. That's when the girl shifted in Lena's arms, pulling back just enough to look up at her face. The child's eyes were red from crying, her cheeks streaked with tears, and when she spoke her voice was so small that Lena almost didn't hear it over the noise of the emergency vehicles and the crowd. "Mummy." The word dropped into the chaos like a stone into still water, and everything seemed to stop. The paramedic's hands froze. The man's face went absolutely white. Lena felt her heart stutter in her chest as she processed what the girl had just said, what she'd just called her. The girl's fingers tightened in Lena's apron, her lower lip trembling. "Mummy, don't leave me." Lena's throat closed. She looked at the man, desperate for him to correct his daughter, to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, but he was staring at the girl with an expression that looked like grief and hope tangled together into something painful. His lips moved but no sound came out. Lena tried to speak gently, her hand stroking the girl's hair in what she hoped was a soothing gesture. "Sweetheart, I'm not your mummy. I'm just a waitress who was happy to help you. Your daddy is right here." The girl shook her head violently, pressing closer to Lena's chest. "You saved me. Mummy saves. That's what mummies do." The logic was childlike and heartbreaking, and Lena felt something crack open inside her chest that she didn't have a name for. She looked at the man again, silently begging him to help her navigate this impossible moment, But he seemed frozen, his eyes locked on his daughter like he was seeing something he'd thought was lost forever. A woman in tactical gear appeared at the man's shoulder and spoke rapidly in Italian. He responded without looking away from his daughter, his voice carrying an edge of command that made it clear he was used to being obeyed. The woman nodded and moved away, speaking into a radio. The man finally seemed to collect himself. He reached out slowly, carefully, as if afraid the moment might shatter. "This kind woman helped you, but we need to let the doctors take care of her now." The girl Isabella turned to look at her father, and her expression held something that made Lena's heart ache. "Why can't she come with us? Why can't she stay?" The man's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. "Because she has her own life, Piccola. Her own family." Lena heard herself speaking before she'd made the conscious decision to do so. "I don't mind coming along. Just until she's calmer. That would help." The man's eyes snapped to her face and she saw surprise there, followed by something that might have been respect. He nodded once, a sharp movement, then stood and began issuing orders to the people around them in a tone that suggested this was a man accustomed to control, to making things happen with nothing more than his word. The paramedic managed to treat Lena's shoulder while she held Isabella, who refused to be separated from her for even the few minutes the examination required. The bullet had grazed rather than penetrated, which the paramedic said made her lucky, though Lena wasn't sure lucky was the right word for any of this. They bandaged her up, gave her something for the pain, and then she found herself being guided into the back of a black sedan with Isabella still clinging to her hand. The man slid into the seat across from them, and Lena finally understood that she'd just agreed to leave with someone whose name she didn't even know. The realization should have terrified her, but she was too exhausted and too focused on the little girl pressed against her side to properly process the danger she might be in. The man seemed to read her thoughts. "My name is Marco DeSantis. This is my daughter Isabella. You saved her life today." Lena nodded slowly, her brain trying to catch up with everything that had happened in the last hour. "Lena Moore. And I just did what anyone with a conscience would do." Marco's expression suggested that he lived in a world where not everyone had a conscience, but he didn't say it out loud. Instead he pulled out his phone and began making calls in rapid Italian, his voice low and intense. Lena caught enough words to understand that people were being dispatched, locations secured and threats assessed. She was beginning to understand that Marco DeSantis was not someone who worked in an office or ran a legitimate business, and that the attack on the café had been very specifically targeting him. The car pulled through gates that opened automatically, revealing a property that looked more like a fortress than a home. High walls. Cameras. Men in suits standing at strategic positions. Lena's stomach dropped as the reality of her situation crystallized, but Isabella's hand was still in hers, small and trusting, and she couldn't bring herself to pull away. They were shown inside, and a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and efficient movements appeared immediately. Marco spoke to her in Italian and she nodded, then turned to Lena with a warm smile. "I'm Sofia, Marco's sister. Let me show you to a room where you can rest. We'll have a doctor examine that shoulder properly and we'll find you some clean clothes." Lena started to protest that she should just go home, but Isabella's grip tightened painfully on her hand. The little girl looked up at her with those huge, dark eyes, and Lena felt every argument die in her throat. Just for a little while she heard herself say, "Until she's ready to let go." Sophia's expression softened with understanding, and she led them upstairs to a guest room that was larger than Lena's entire apartment. Isabella refused to leave Lena's side while the doctor examined her shoulder, standing so close that the doctor finally just worked around her. The wound was cleaned and properly bandaged, antibiotics prescribed, and Lena was given strict instructions to rest and avoid strenuous activity. As the doctor packed up his supplies, Isabella tugged on Lena's hand. "Will you stay with me tonight? I don't like being alone when it's dark." Lena looked at Sophia, uncertain, and saw only encouragement in the other woman's face. "She's had nightmares since her mother died. 2 years now. She hasn't slept through a full night in all that time." The information hit Lena like a punch to the chest. She looked down at Isabella, seeing the child's request in a completely different light. This wasn't just about today's trauma. This was about a little girl who'd been living with loss and fear for so long that she'd forgotten what safety felt like. Lena knelt down, ignoring the protest from her shoulder, until she was eye level with Isabella. "I'll stay tonight. I promise. But tomorrow we'll need to talk about what happens next, okay?" Isabella threw her arms around Lena's neck and over the child's shoulder. Lena saw Marco standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something that looked like wonder and pain mixed together. That night, Lena found herself lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room, with a 6-year-old girl curled against her side like she'd been doing it her whole life. Isabella had insisted on holding Lena's hand even as she fell asleep, her breathing gradually evening out into the rhythm of childhood rest. Lena stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened, trying to understand how her life had been completely overturned in the space of a single afternoon. She must have dozed off eventually, because she woke to find Isabella thrashing beside her, small sounds of distress escaping her throat. Lena pulled the girl close, murmuring reassurances, and Isabella's eyes opened, unfocused and afraid in the dim light filtering through the curtains. "Mummy?" Lena's heart broke and mended and broke again. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe. I'm right here." Isabella settled back against her, and within minutes was sleeping peacefully again. Lena lay awake for a long time after that, the word mummy echoing through her mind like a question she didn't know how to answer. The next morning she met with Marco in his study. He looked like he hadn't slept either, dark circles under his eyes and tension in every line of his body. He gestured for her to sit and she did, suddenly aware that she was wearing borrowed clothes and living in a stranger's home and had absolutely no plan for what came next. Marco spoke first, his voice careful and measured. "You need to understand something, Miss Moore. The attack yesterday was not random. I have enemies. People who would hurt my daughter to hurt me. And now they know that you saved her. They know that Isabella has formed an attachment to you." Lena's blood ran cold. "You're saying I'm in danger now?" Marco nodded, and something in his expression looked almost apologetic. "I'm saying that my world is dangerous and you've become part of it whether you intended to or not. I can offer you protection. Money. A new identity somewhere far from here if that's what you choose." The offer was generous, more than generous, and Lena knew she should take it. Should run as far and as fast as she could from this man and his dangerous life and the violence that followed him like a shadow. But then she remembered the way Isabella had held her hand through the night, the way the little girl had slept peacefully for the first time in 2 years, the way she'd looked at Lena like she was the answer to every prayer she'd been too scared to say out loud. "What does Isabella want?" Lena asked quietly. Marco's laugh was bitter and sad. "My daughter wants a mother. She wants someone who won't disappear. Someone who stays when things get hard." Lena met his eyes. "And what do you want?" Marco was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Lena understand just how much this man had lost. "I want my daughter to smile again. I want her to sleep through the night without screaming. I want her to feel safe in a world that has taught her nothing but fear. If you can give her that even for a little while, then I want you to stay. But I won't lie to you about what that means. It means living under protection. It means constant vigilance. It means accepting that my enemies are now your enemies too." The smart choice was obvious. The safe choice was clear. Lena should take the money and the new identity and disappear into a life where little girls didn't call her mummy and bullets didn't shatter cafe windows on ordinary Tuesday afternoons. But when she opened her mouth, different words came out. "Running is easy. Staying is hard. Isabella needs someone who won't disappear." Marco stared at her like she'd just spoken in a language he didn't understand. "You're choosing to stay? In a life that could get you killed?" Lena thought about her sister who never called back, her apartment with its broken heater, her job at the cafe where she'd been just another invisible face serving coffee to people who never bothered to learn her name. She thought about the weight of Isabella's hand in hers and the way the little girl had whispered mummy like it was the most precious word in the world. "I'm choosing to stay for as long as Isabella needs me. After that we'll see." Something shifted in Marco's expression, a wall coming down that she suspected didn't lower for many people. He nodded once, sharp and decisive, and she knew that everything had just changed. Her old life was gone. Whatever came next would be nothing like anything she'd known before. The weeks that followed were a strange adjustment. Lena learned the routines of the house, the protocols for security, the careful way everyone moved through Marco's world like they were playing a game with lethal consequences for mistakes. She learned that Marco ran an organization that existed in the shadows of the law, that the men who worked for him were loyal to the point of death, and that the attack on the cafe had been orchestrated by a rival faction trying to expand their territory. She also learned that Isabella was smart and funny and desperately lonely beneath her careful politeness. The little girl had been raised by bodyguards and housekeepers, taught to be quiet and obedient and never to draw attention to herself. She'd learned to survive in a world of adults and violence, but she'd forgotten how to be a child. Lena set about changing that. She read books with Isabella every night, created art projects that left the kitchen table covered in glitter and paint, taught her silly songs and made up games that filled the quiet house with laughter. She helped with homework and bandaged scraped knees and sat with Isabella through nightmares until the little girl learned to trust that Lena would still be there when morning came. Marco watched it all with an expression that grew softer day by day. 6 weeks after the café attack, Sophia found Lena in the garden where she was helping Isabella plant flowers. The older woman sat on the bench nearby, her expression thoughtful. "You should know something about Isabella's mother," Sophia said quietly. "She was killed in a bombing meant for Marco. A car explosion. Isabella was supposed to be with her that day, but she'd stayed home with a cold. She spent 2 years thinking that if she'd been there, maybe she could have saved her mother. Or maybe she was supposed to die too." The words made Lena's chest hurt. She watched Isabella carefully pressing soil around a small plant, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. "When you threw yourself between Isabella and those bullets," Sophia continued, "you gave her something she's been desperately needing. Proof that she's worth saving. That someone would choose her safety over their own. You didn't just save her life, Lena. You saved what was left of her ability to trust." Lena didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and turned her attention back to Isabella, who was excitedly showing her the earthworm she'd discovered in the soil. That night Marco asked to speak with her again. They sat in the study and he poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking if she wanted one. She took it, surprised to find her hands were shaking slightly. "The men responsible for the attack are no longer a threat," Marco said without preamble. "It's over. You're safe now. Isabella's safe." Relief flooded through Lena, so strong it left her dizzy. "It's good. That's really good." Marco nodded, but he didn't look happy. "Which means you're free to leave if you want. I'll honor my original offer. Money. A new life. Whatever you need." Lena took a sip of whiskey, the burn helping her focus. "And if I don't want to leave?" Marco's hand tightened on his glass. "Then you need to understand what staying means. Not just for now but for the future. Isabella calls you Mummy now. Every day. She talks about you like you hung the moon. If you stay, you're not just staying as her caretaker or her guardian. You're staying as her mother." The word settled over Lena like a weight and a gift at the same time. "I know." Marco met her eyes and she saw vulnerability there that she suspected he rarely showed anyone. "My daughter has had her heart broken once already. If you're going to leave eventually, it's better to do it now. Before she's in too deep." Lena set down her glass carefully. "Marco, I'm already in too deep. I think I have been since the moment she called me Mummy in that alley. I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to." Something in Marco's expression cracked, and for just a moment she saw past the dangerous man who ran a criminal empire to the father who would do anything to protect his child. "Thank you," he said simply. "For giving her back something I thought she'd lost forever." The months rolled forward, and Lena enrolled in early childhood education classes at a nearby university, traveling with a security detail that she gradually got used to. She made a home within Marco's fortress, turning the guest room into her own space while keeping the bed Isabella preferred to sleep in right next door. She learned Italian from Sophia and basic self-defense from Marco's head of security. She built a life that looked nothing like anything she'd imagined and somehow felt more right than anything that had come before. Isabella bloomed like one of the flowers in their garden. She laughed more, cried less, started bringing home friends from school and talking about what she wanted to be when she grew up. The nightmares didn't disappear completely, but they became less frequent, less intense, and she learned to seek comfort when they came instead of suffering through them alone. Marco changed too in ways Lena noticed but didn't comment on. He came home earlier, took fewer risks, restructured parts of his organization to minimize exposure around Isabella. He started joining them for dinner every night, and sometimes Lena would catch him watching them together with an expression that looked like gratitude and grief and hope all mixed into something too complex to name. One evening in late autumn, Lena was tucking Isabella into bed when the little girl caught her hand and held it tight. "Can I ask you something?" Isabella's voice was small but steady. "Always," Lena promised. "Do you remember your real mummy?" Lena's throat tightened. She did remember, though the memories were faded now, worn soft by time. Yes, sweetheart. I do. Isabella was quiet for a moment. I'm starting to forget mine. Her voice. What she smelled like. Sometimes I can't remember her face unless I look at pictures. Lena pulled Isabella into a hug, feeling tears prick at her eyes. That's okay, baby. That's normal. It doesn't mean you love her any less. Isabella pulled back just enough to look up at Lena's face. I know you're not really my mummy. I know you didn't give birth to me or anything. But you're the mummy I have now. Is that okay? Lena had to swallow hard before she could speak. That's more than okay. That's everything. They sat together in comfortable silence until Isabella's breathing evened out in sleep. And when Lena finally left the room, she found Marco standing in the hallway. His expression told her he'd heard at least part of the conversation. She changed my life, Lena said softly. I didn't know how much I needed someone to need me until she looked at me like I was worth saving too. Marco stepped closer, and for the first time since she'd met him, he reached out to touch her face, his hand gentle against her cheek. You didn't just save my daughter's life that day. You saved what was left of mine. Before Lena could respond, before she could process what she saw in his eyes, Isabella's voice called out sleepily from her room. Mummy? Papa? Are you still there? They moved together to her doorway, and Isabella sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes. Can you both stay until I fall asleep again? Marco looked at Lena, a question in his eyes, and she nodded. They settled on either side of Isabella's bed, and the little girl reached out to take both their hands, pulling them together until they were linked across her small body. My family, Isabella murmured, and then she was asleep again, her breathing soft and even in the quiet room. Lena looked across at Marco and saw her own wonder reflected in his face. They stayed like that for a long time, holding hands across the sleeping child between them, both understanding that something profound had shifted. That the waitress who'd run toward gunfire had become the woman who rebuilt what violence had broken. That the little girl who'd lost everything had found a way back to trust. That the man who'd thought his heart was beyond repair had been proven wrong by a stranger with kind eyes and the courage to stay when anyone else would have run. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, but inside, the three of them were warm and safe and together. A family made not by blood but by choice. By a split-second decision in a café full of chaos. By a little girl's desperate need and a waitress's instinct to protect. By a father's love and a woman's refusal to give up on either of them. Isabella's hand tightened slightly in sleep, holding them both close, and neither Marco nor Lena moved to pull away. They sat in the dim light of the bedroom, listening to the rain and the child's peaceful breathing, and understood that this was what they'd both been searching for without knowing it. This was home. This was family. This was the life that began the moment Lena Moore stopped being just a waitress and became the woman who ran toward danger instead of away from it. The woman who caught a falling child and refused to let go. The woman who proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay when every instinct tells you to run. The woman who became a mother because a little girl needed her to be. And that was worth more than any safety she'd left behind. Thank you for listening till the end. Please subscribe and tell me where you are watching from in the comments.